大家好，欢迎大家来到今日点击的特别节目《坦克人的故事》，我是石涛。在南池子或者南长街儿，就是在天安门广场，劳动人民文化宫和中山公园两侧的两条路，一条路叫做南池子，一条路叫做南长街儿。大概是7号到8号左右的时候，我印象中是在南长街儿从天安门广场进去往里走，大概在200米左右，有一个副食店。这是6月份，副食店往往在6月份的时候呢，就在外面摆柜台啊，铁柜子卖菜。铁柜子大概在1米高，然后大概80公分到90公分的宽，上面放菜，沿着马路牙子放，一般都是那样的。大概在6月8号、6月9号的时候，在南长街儿，也可能是南池子，我有点记不住，但我印象中是南长街儿。从这个副食店的里面抠出一个人来，是个年轻人，死了好几天了，人臭了。
All the way from the western suburbs till they finally, several hours later, about 1:30 a.m. began to arrive at Tiananmen Square, which was ground zero. This was the crunch time. We knew the troops had orders to clear the square by dawn. That was the deadline.
We heard this roar of male yelling and saw on the steps of the Museum of Revolutionary History and then across the way on the steps of the Great Hall of the People, thousands of soldiers, just saw the glint of their weaponry. It was clear to everyone from that point on we were absolutely trapped. You had the military coming in from the west with their tanks. We knew there were tanks coming from the south up Tiananmen Gate, and now on both sides of the square you had hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers.
And then the firing started. Even at this late stage, many couldn't believe the army was using live ammunition, and they stood their ground.
And you just hear this thunderous sound of gunfire. All the gunfire kept going. You could see tracer bullets in the sky. There was a battle going on, and there were only civilians, and they were the targets.
One man was shot down. Someone ran up and dragged that man. I didn't. I just kept running. On my left side, someone was hit in the neck. Everyone was running.
There was a lot of shooting. A lot of young people were running towards the military, being shot, falling, and then running away.
People were running to the square, and they were running from the square. And people were racing to the square on bikes, racing out of the square on bikes. The ambulances started to go in.
There was a lot of smoke. The lights were on the square. And there was this continual announcement of, under the martial law regulations, no one should be on the street. If you stay on the street, you will be responsible for what happens to you. This sort of continual bass beat of that evening was these announcements.
About 4:15 in the morning, suddenly all the lights in the square went out. Pitch dark. This was very frightening.
And then I heard these horrible crushing sounds, like when tanks run over things, crushing splinter sounds.
After about 10 minutes, the lights came on again. But not the normal lights in the square. They stayed off. Instead, they put on the special display lights that lit up the Great Hall of the People. It was like this Götterdämmerung effect of the vast, cavernous great hall of the people lit up by floodlights. Smoke rising all around, and at that point we could see just a river of troops flowing out of the great hall of the people onto the steps and deploying in front of the monument to the people's heroes.
The students had made their last stand at the monument. They had witnessed the shooting and killing as the armies swept through the square towards them, and many expected the same treatment themselves. But they were wrong. The soldiers held their fire, and the students were offered amnesty if they vacated the square at once.
Should we stay or should we go was put to a voice vote among the students there. It was clear to me that the stay votes were much, much, much stronger. But Feng Congde, who was a student leader at the time, said, the goes have it.
From my point of view, the important thing was to avoid more injury and death. So I made the decision to lead the students out of the square. 3,000 to 5,000 students and citizens left the square by the southeast corner.
All the students held hands and started singing the Internationale, and soothed each other with the belief that one day we would be back.
I'll never forget those faces, the young people's faces. They were walking out with their heads held high. They'd finessed their retreat from the square so well. They'd performed so bravely. And finally they'd made the right decision. There would have been no point staying there. Everyone would have been killed. Reports in the week after June 4th stated that troops had assaulted the monument and massacred all the students on the monument. Thousands of students had been shot down in cold blood. That didn't happen. Had it happened, I wouldn't be here today. Simple as that. The theatre of the massacre was by and large elsewhere. It was the rest of the city, and that was where the Beijing citizens fought and died.
Later that morning, amazing things started to happen. People astonishingly started holding hands, walking up the avenue, trying to re-enter the square in the face of these tanks.
These people were frantic. They were nuts, out of their minds. And the reason they were out of their minds is that these were the parents of students who had been in the square that night. These parents were running back and forth, and they were saying, "We want to go into the square, looking for our children." Then an officer came out with a loud hailer, and he said, "I'm going to count to 5, and then we're going to fire."
Then all the people would realize that the guns were pointed at them, and they'd go running past the hotel. And then the soldiers would fire in their backs. I felt like I was watching some terrible opera.
And a lot of people went down. 30, 40, 50 people are knocked down. Everybody else ran away. I'm lying in the grass thinking, this is the worst thing ever. This is hell.
But the odd thing was then after a little while, like 40 minutes, an hour, people would gather their nerve again and crawl back to the corner and start screaming at the soldiers. And then the commander would eventually give another signal, and the soldiers would raise their rifles again. And people go, "Oh my God," and they'd run away and they'd shoot more in the backs. And this went on more than half a dozen times in the day. It was, to me, unbelievable.
There then suddenly appeared, right there, an ambulance. And they rush in amongst all the people who were on the ground. And the soldiers open fire again and mow them down.
The soldiers shot everybody. Doctors, nurses, rescuers. Everybody was being shot at.
This was seen by numbers of journalists who will never forget it. This was a real massacre. This was the targeting and the shooting down of totally non-violent innocent civilians.
The tactics of overwhelming force that were used had a point. They were meant to shock, terrify, and awe. And they did. Terror works.
No one knows for certain how many people died. The Chinese Red Cross initially reported 2,600 and immediately retracted under intense government pressure. The official figure is 241 dead, including 23 officers and soldiers and 7,000 wounded. All we can be sure of is that by the third day, June the 5th, the army was in complete control. Beijing seemed utterly vanquished until an unknown young man made his astounding gesture of defiance.
The symbolism of what he did was overwhelmingly clear. He spoke for the Beijing people. Before June 4th, you had millions of people all over China in the cities, up in the streets, peacefully demanding more rights, freedom, democracy, press freedom, end to corruption. After June 4th, what did you have? You had one man, one sacrificial figure almost, who took it on himself to speak for everyone else who had been silenced by that time.
But what happened to that young man?